Good morning, I'm Morgan Donner, and today I wanted to talk to you all about mock-ups. So in manufacturing, a mock-up is the model of a design, the prototype. You use it to test out your concept and see if there's any changes that you might want to make before you make the final product or project. In the world of sewing, a mock-up is sometimes called a toile or a muslin, but since those terms can also sometimes be referring to specific fabrics, I'm going to go ahead and use mock-up for the rest of this video. I just literally cannot more highly sing the praises of using a mock-up in your sewing. Mock-ups are really great for a number of reasons. First off, you can test the size and the fit of the garment that you're making and make any adjustments that you might need to make to that garment before committing your really nice fabric to the cause. I make tons and tons of mock-ups, going over and over again, making changes and adding things, taking away things until I'm really satisfied and pretty confident in the result I'm going to get. Secondly, you can use the mock-up as a sort of construction test run. So if there are any parts of your pattern that are maybe a little bit tricky or you're not quite sure how different elements fit together, the mock-up provides you the opportunity to practice sewing those pieces or figuring out how they go together. Mechanically, you're training your eyes, your hands, your brain how to make this thing that you haven't even started making yet. Today I'm going to be making a mock-up for the pattern that I sized up in my last video, Herjolfsnes number 38. It's an early 15th century gown from a Norse settlement in Greenland, and this particular pattern is notable for its many side gores, and it has some really beautiful tapered shaping throughout the torso that I'm excited to try on those gores. I will be making my mock-up out of some red plain woven cotton sheets, quite literally sheets that we just don't have a use for anymore, so now they can be reused for mock-ups. You could also use any old fabric that you still have lying around, maybe something that's not your favorite color, your favorite print, or maybe it's leftover from a previous project. Thrift stores can be a really great place to find some old sheets or fabric that would work really well for mock-ups. Alternatively, you can also buy a whole bolt of muslin from your local fabric store, maybe next time they're having a sale, and then just keep that on hand for all of your future mock-up needs. My sheets are maybe a little bit wrinkled, so I'm going to go ahead and iron those nice and smooth. That way I don't have to worry about pleats and folds and things underneath my pattern paper disrupting the correctness of my traced patterns. I started out tracing my pattern in chalk, but I felt like I wasn't really getting a good, tight, and accurate line, so I tried it again with pen out of curiosity. Comparing the two though, I really feel like the resulting lines were approximately in the same place, so I just went ahead and went back to chalk, since after all, that's what I'm more likely to use on my actual fabric anyway. My pattern pieces here do not include seam allowance, so I'm making sure to leave at least a couple centimeters between each piece. Don't forget to transfer any marks and notches as you go along. If your pattern has any, you'll want to keep those to help correctly align the various seams later on. You know, speaking of notches and things, if you're making your own pattern or you are clumsily sizing one up, a mock-up's also a really good chance to double check that all of your different seams are going to line up correctly and are true to each other. For example, after double checking, I realized that this side seam here does not quite perfectly line up. I accidentally made one side about 1 centimeter too long. Understandable when you're counting a bunch of little tiny 1 centimeter squares out of a book for your pattern. I probably just accidentally counted one square too many somewhere. I'm not going to worry about cutting this even just yet. Instead, I'll make a quick note of it and move on. The sleeve pattern is all sorts of bizarre though. I was looking at it and I swear that it is not at all even. See where these notch marks are here at the top and bottom? I measured them. They're about 3 centimeters different from each other in height. I do not understand. I double checked that pattern piece in the book that I'm using for this pattern, Medieval Garments Reconstructed, just to double check that I didn't make a mistake there when transferring the pattern over onto paper. And the original is also 3 centimeters different from each other. I thought about it for a little bit and realized that maybe that triangular gusset piece is playing a role here. And I think that it maybe does make a little bit more sense now, since one side of the gusset is longer than the other, which is where that extra length comes into play up here. But for the sleeve cuff, no matter how you slice it, one edge of the sleeve cuff is longer than the other. That's just how it is. I asked around, and a fantastic person online pointed out that this passage from another book, Woven into the Earth, which is about that same Greenland find, and it explicitly says that the original extant garment did in fact have uneven sleeves. That is super exciting because now I don't have to worry about it. That's how the original was, that's why the pattern is like this. I haven't done anything wrong, everything's fine, let's keep going. Since the paper pattern that I'm using does not contain any seam allowance, I'm going to go ahead and add that in now. For the final version, I might do this a little bit differently, but for a quick machine sewn mock-up, I would like a fairly consistent allowance, so I'm going to go ahead and add a centimeter all around all of the pieces I've traced so far. Every time I use this little measuring gauge thing, I get questions about where it's from, so look for a link in the description box about that. So now that I have all of my fabric pieces all cut out and placed in the order in which they will eventually be assembled, I double check that I have all the correct pattern pieces and I've not accidentally missed one or cut an extra. It looks like everything's here, so I'm going to go ahead and start out with the center front and the center back gores first. Those are the triangular shaped pieces that will be inserted into the split. I stitched the long gore pieces together, transforming them from 2 small triangles into 1 larger triangle. I'm too lazy to go ahead and turn that iron back on though, so I'm just going to press the seam flat with my hands. Setting in a gore can be, understandably, I feel, rather tricky, so I really recommend starting from the tip of the gore up here and then sew away from the center. If you sew up from the bottom, sometimes the pieces will shift around and you don't want the tip to end up much higher than you intended, nor lower, and suddenly you've got a hole here. I really recommend starting at the top. We're currently looking at the inside of the garment, so all of the seam allowance raw edges are up towards us, and looking at approximately where the chalk marks should converge here, I'll use a pin to mark the end point where the inset piece will meet the body piece. I'll line that up with the very tippy top here and then pin them together. This is just temporary, but it will help keep these pieces from moving around on me. You'll note here that these 2 raw edges do not meet up at all. Ignore that for now. We're going to move down a couple inches and start pinning here. Once you've pinned the whole first seam, let's go ahead and pin the second half. Again, ignoring the first couple inches and just start pinning after that. Now that the second line has been pinned, we can go ahead and start sewing, but we're only going to stitch from these first 2 pins up here and onward. Do not sew the odd sort of unaligned seam area up here. We're going to tackle that in a bit. We've sewn up to here and we have these last couple inches to go. Sewing this last little bit is something that I would normally do by hand, but I'm in a stubborn mood, so I'll keep machining it. Sometimes I find it really helpful to add a temporary pin to mark the exact center above the split, because that'll tell me when I've reached the center. I know that this isn't the easiest to see, but the center seam of my gore is now matched up with the end of my pinpoint here. And when I take this over to the machine, I'm going to start as close as I can to the very tippy tip end here, and I'll let my seam allowance get wider and wider and wider until I meet up again with my original stitch line. We've joined up again with the original seam, and it gets narrower and narrower on the body's seam allowance as we go back up. Now we're going to flip this over to the other side and, as best as we can, repeat the same thing on this half. Alright, here's the moment of truth. How well did we do? Not bad. I didn't quite get that very end part perfectly, and looking inside confirms that I didn't actually get the two ends of stitching to match up, but for a mock-up, this is good enough. On an actual project, you'd probably want to go ahead and stitch these little end bits down to secure the threads. The rest of the body seams from here on out are pretty straightforward, nothing terribly tricky going on here. As always, even with mock-ups, I went ahead and ironed all of my seam allowances flat. Normally I open the seam allowances, but the original specifies that they were turned to one side and stitched flat, so I'll go ahead and iron my mock-up that way too. At this point in the story, our heroine is still puzzling mightily over the oddity of the sleeve seam and its curious, uneven state, so I was studying the book again. Fortunately, I had Sweet Catherine to help keep me company. Here are the sleeves, laid out and ready to stitch. I'll attach the sleeve gusset pizza part first, and then we'll line up the chalk marks here and stitch up the rest of the seam. With the sleeve and arm side complete, let's go ahead and join the two up. First, I'll match the mark where the top of the sleeve head is with the shoulder seam, and then put the sleeve inside the body for now so we can easily pin its edges to the body. So all of our main construction seams are done at this point, and normally for a mock-up I would go ahead and just be done, but I did have a bit of extra time writing to an event this weekend, and it is kind of rather nice to be able to see the finished size and look of a neckline as a reference for how the final version is going to look. And with that, our mock-up is all done. Yay! Now it's time for the really important stuff. Analyzing your mock-up. Doing a practice run of making your garment is all well and good, but half the value is in sitting down and really taking a look at your result. When you've made a mock-up and try it on, I really recommend at a minimum to go ahead and take some pictures, but even better is video. Looking at the fit of your garment in the mirror just doesn't seem to quite tell the whole story. For a start, let's look at the overall size and silhouette. It is certainly on the loose side, but then again, most of the people who studied and published information about these garments agree that they are not really meant to be tight-fitting. Portraiture and illustrations contemporary to around the same time period, 1430 or so, show very fitted fashions, particularly in the torso, but do consider that these painters were about 2,000 miles or 3,000 kilometers from Greenland. They aren't exactly receiving the freshest fashion magazines. It's very reasonable to assume that some of their fashions are going to reflect slightly older styles. All of that, I think, is a really long-winded way of saying that this garment is not necessarily going to resemble European garments contemporary to the same time. But that said, one absolutely could adapt this pattern to be more fitted if that is your desire. I am actually in mighty need of a really simple slip-on garment for camping, so that's part of why I chose this pattern in the first place. I've been avoiding starting this pattern for a while now, in part out of vanity. I tend towards really fitted styles, and this is not. But it is, however, exactly what I need right now. With that out of the way, let's see if there's anything on this dress that I would like to alter. I'm not 100% sold on the mismatched sleeve lengths, but there is something sort of quirky and charming about it, so I'm actually kind of leaning towards leaving it in for the final gown. I've seen other recreations of this gown from various reenactors. Some of them leave the mismatched length, and some of them like to even it up. What do you think? I do really like the split though. I can certainly see how that would be really handy for rolling your sleeves up to wash your hands or dishes and such. The sleeves are maybe a touch short, especially when you consider that I still have a centimeter of seam allowance visible here, so I should probably go ahead and add 1 or 2 more. I have seen many complaints and warnings that this is a short gown, but because I'm maybe on the slightly petite side, it's actually almost a rather nice length on me. Since this is an over gown, I wore the mock-up with an undergown below it, which nicely illustrates that the red fabric could probably stand to gain a few centimeters at the hem. The original gown had a pocket slit in the middle of this first gore where you could tuck your hands in, and even though I didn't actually cut that open for this, I do think that the placement here should work fine. The deep arm opening is a little bit curious, and I was a little bit worried about it, to be honest, in the drafting stage, but I can see now that the sleeve gusset opens up downward toward the side and helps fill in that space without creating a lot of volume in the upper sleeve. The neckline is fine. Nothing terribly sexy or exciting, but it's fine. If I did succumb to modern vanity, I might reduce the width of the center back panel just a smidge to help reduce the loose fit in the torso, and perhaps lower the center front gore by another centimeter or 2 so that the fullness is being added at the start of my hips rather than mid-belly. We'll see what I actually end up doing, I suppose. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed watching my video on making a mock-up. If you haven't already, maybe consider watching the video where I made the pattern for this one. And I hope that this was helpful, useful, interesting, all those good things for you. I find mock-ups to be incredibly helpful and informative in telling me lots of information about the pattern that I'm trying to make. If any more of you send me questions about how is my pattern looking, my first question back to you is going to be, have you made a mock-up?